How's it going today, guys? This is going to be kind of a weird episode because I've been thinking a lot about the old pioneer farmer houses of eastern Washington, and I was kind of driving around a pioneer farmer area, and I noticed one of the local listings. There was this house that was probably at least 4 bedrooms. It was a really big, like really well built, like nice farmhouse um, out in this certain area, and it was only $150,000, and that kind of blew me away because I expected it to be more like 750,000, maybe even a million. Like I said, this is a huge house, and it's been very well maintained and whatnot, and so I was pondering why it was only for sale for 150,000, and I know it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and to work like a skilled labor job besides farming itself, you're going to have to go at least 50 miles to get to a city that has, reasonable pay. And as I was looking deeper into it, they want like 8,500 a year for taxes. And that's what blew me away. And I think that's the reason why the house was only $150,000, just because it was such a high tax bill. At least I think that's a high tax bill. I know people in the town of Grand Coulee that I live in personally that only pay like 600 or 700 a year. So 8,500 a year, that seems pretty, that's a lot to me. So I know I wouldn't be able to live out there because I'd need a running vehicle, and I'd have to go long, like drive long distances to have a job that would enable me to maintain a car, just take care of the house itself, and then let alone that $8,500 a year in taxes. Geez. So I was thinking about that a lot, and it put a lot of different ideas into my mind. So I had this pretty interesting conversation with ChatGPT that I want to read to you guys and kind of talk to you guys about today, because I've really learned a lot through this conversation that I've had with AI about this subject. So let's get into it. I started out, I said, "Hey, ChatGPT, so I'm thinking about the pioneer farmer of Eastern Washington and the Homestead Act." And ChatGPT responded, "That's a really rich vein to dig into, both historically and narratively. The Homestead Act of 1862 is the backbone of why so many ended up in eastern Washington's tough, dry lands. Here are a few angles to frame it around the pioneer farmer experience." And so they're just kind of, ChatGPT is just kind of going into a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about. Their first talking point is the promise of the Homestead Act. And they basically outline any adult citizen could claim 160 acres of federal land if they agreed to improve it by building a dwelling and cultivating crops. And after 5 years of residence and work, the title would become theirs outright. On paper, it was a dream: free land, independence, and a chance to build something permanent. Talking point number two: why Eastern Washington? Railroads and land speculators promoted the Columbia Plateau and the Palouse as fertile wheat country, though much of it was semi arid steppe. Immigrants, Civil War veterans, and poor families from the Midwest poured in, chasing the idea of independence. Talking point number three: the reality of farming there. The rainfall line made or broke a homestead. East of the Cascades was often dryland farming, meaning wheat was grown without irrigation. Success depended on timing rains just right. Families dug sod houses or crude log cabins first, often wintering in dugouts until they could raise something sturdier. And they faced locusts, harsh winters, prairie fires, and drought cycles. Many failed before the 5 years were up. Talking point number 4. The Homestead Act gives a farmer clear motivation, 160 acres of hope. The eastern Washington landscape provides conflict, though, like isolation, drought, thin soil. Neighbors, native peoples, railroads, and land speculators also added outside pressures for the farmer. And this is where it got interesting. So I got done with the introduction from ChatGPT, and I was ready to kind of delve more into the conversation that I really wanted to have. And so that's when I asked, okay, ChatGPT, when did they have to start paying land taxes? Also, did they just make their own roads, or did the government make them? I find it hard to believe that they just carved out whatever roads they wanted without any kind of oversight. And then ChatGPT responded, great questions. Those get right into the nuts and bolts of what daily life was actually like for a homesteader in Eastern Washington. And then it presents me with multiple bullet points that I'll read to you guys. So let's get into this. Talking point number 1. Land taxes. Homesteaders didn't usually pay property tax on their claim until they had patented it. That is, received the official title deed from the U.S. government after fulfilling all of the Homestead Act requirements. Before that, the land was technically federal property, actually. Talking point number 2. After receiving the patent, once the deed was issued, the land became private property, and county property taxes applied. In Washington Territory, before statehood in 1889, counties levied taxes for schools, roads, and local government. So for the first 5 years, taxes weren't generally collected, but after proving up, the county did expect some revenue. And now let's get into the roads and infrastructure. In the 1860s and 1880s, at first, the settlers relied mostly on wagon trails that were often former native paths, military supply routes, or cattle trails to move around. They didn't have free rein to carve random roads, but they often improved rough trails themselves just to reach markets or neighbors. Local responsibility. Territorial and later county governments were responsible for designating county roads, but they had really tiny budgets, so settlers were often legally required to contribute a certain number of days of labor each year to road maintenance, instead of, or in addition to, sometimes taxes. This was called a statute labor system. Basically, each adult man had to work on the roads near his homestead. Roads often had to be petitioned. A group of settlers would submit a request to the county commissioners, who would send out viewers to lay out a surveyed route. Once approved, that became an official county road. As towns sprang up, railroads often laid out griddled street plans, like Spokane, Colfax, or Ritzville. These became the backbone for more official roads connecting farms to rail depots. In short, taxes didn't hit until they owned the land, and the roads were a mix of self-help, county oversight, and community labor. Not totally random, but not top-down government-funded highways either. And so I thought that was pretty interesting. So then I said, okay, ChatGPT, What was the tax rate in 1890 compared to now? Do we pay higher taxes now, or did we pay higher taxes then in 1890? And ChatGPT responded, "This is a really good question, because at first glance it feels like taxes must have been much lower back then. And they were, but only in a certain sense. Let's break it down. Property taxes in Washington in 1890. Washington became a state in 1889. In 1890, the new state constitution limited the regular property tax to 1% of the assessed value, unless voters approved for more in the future. Counties, towns, and school districts could levy their own property taxes on top of that. But the total usually came to about 1%, maybe 1.5% of the property's assessed value. Assessment was lower than market value at that time in 1890, often around 25 to 50% of what the land could actually sell for. So the effective tax did feel lighter in that sense. For example, a 160-acre homestead valued at, say, $1,000 might only be assessed at $400, and at 1%, the annual tax bill could be $4. That doesn't sound like much, but we must remember, $4 in 1890 is about $140 in today's money, and cash was scarce on the homestead. A single tax bill could mean selling eggs, hauling firewood, or taking on wage labor to make the money. Now let's talk about property taxes now in Washington State in the 2020s. Today, Washington's average property tax rate is about 0.9% of market value, but it varies by county. Unlike in 1890, assessments are much closer to the actual market value. For example, a modest home worth $400,000 might pay around $3,600 a year in property taxes. So let's talk about the comparison. Rate-wise, the comparison is pretty similar, around 1% then and now. But burden-wise, it's much heavier today because land and homes are astronomically more valuable, and local governments now fund schools, roads, firefighters, libraries, and much more through property taxes. Back then, a farmer might pay just a few dollars a year, but that could be hard to scrape together in a cash-poor economy. Now, the numbers are far, far higher, but for most households, property tax is one thin slice of a much larger tax system, including income tax, sales tax, payroll taxes, etc., which all barely existed in 1890. So in short, tax rates were about the same, but the tax burden is massively higher today because property values are higher, assessments are stricter, and the government does far more. And this really got my brain going. This was a really informative back and forth I had with this AI. So I replied, "Can you tell me exactly why the modern dollar burden is so much higher today? And tell me in deep detail?" And ChatGPT responded, "Nice, let's go deep. Below, I'll walk through every major mechanism that turns a small 1890 tax bill into thousands that we see today. I'll show the math on the concrete example we already used. I'll explain the economic and legal changes behind each mechanism and flag important caveats and next steps. Now the quick numeric takeaway. Using the example we already worked with, a 160-acre homestead taxed at $4 in 1890 versus a comparable 160-acre parcel taxed at $3,600 today. $4 in 1890 equals $144 in today's dollars. $3,600 divided by 144 comes out to about 25. The modern real inflation adjusted tax bill is about 25 times larger than the 1890 bill on the same acreage. Now nominally it's 900 times larger, 3,600 into $4, or $4 into 3,600. But inflation explains most of that. The remaining is about a 25x. So why did taxes increase that much, 25 times over in the last 130 years? Well, it gets into it, and we're going to break this down into 10 talking points. Talking point number 1, land market value exploded. Why does it matter? Property tax equals tax rate times assessed value. If the assessed value goes way up, taxes do too, even if the rate is similar. And now there are many causes to this value explosion over the last 130 years. Scarcity of free public land. In 1890, there was still a lot of public land to claim, and homesteading created a temporary abundance. Today, there's none of that free land. There's a very finite supply, plus a much larger population. And when you times a finite supply by a growing population, you come up with much higher per acre prices. Also, there's a huge increase in demand. With population growth, urban spillover, second home buyers, investors, and industrial agricultural consolidation, all of these things push prices up. There's massive productivity gains. Irrigation projects, mechanization, better seed and chemicals, and they turned low value dry land into highly productive farmland in many places. More income potential from a parcel equals higher market price. And then you have infrastructure and market access. Railroads, highways, and grain elevators reduce transportation costs. Proximity to markets raises land value. And also there's speculation and non-farm buyers. Farmland has become an asset class for investors. That financial demand raises prices above purely farm use value. Concrete numbers from our example. Market per acre in 1890 example is $1,000. 160 acres is $6.25 an acre. The example of a modern market per acre is about $2,500 per acre. The land price multiplier, it's about 400x, 2,500 divided by $6.25. Because the assessed value tracks market value much more today, this is the main reason the taxes jump, because the land is worth about 400 times more than it was in 1890. Now, talking point number 2, assessment practices changed. Homesteads were underassessed. The 1890 practice was the assessors often valued land at a fraction of market value. anywhere from 25 to 50%, and assessment systems were crude. That reduced the taxable base even when the nominal rate was still 1%. Now, the modern practice, mass appraisal techniques and legal rules tie assessed value much closer to the market value, sometimes equal to the market, or at least revalued regularly. So a 1% rate today applies to a much larger number. The effect in our example. In 1890, the assessed value was $400 on a $1,000 market value. Today, the assessed equals the market. So let's say that same place is worth $400,000. The difference in the assessed base multiplies the tax enormously, because it's going from something being taxed 1% on $400 to something that's being taxed at 1% on $400,000. Talking point number 3, the scope of what property tax pays for exploded. In 1890, local governments were small and spent money on a few essentials like basic road maintenance, a schoolhouse or two, law enforcement. But today, local governments provide a much larger array of costly services, one being public education. You got teachers' salaries, transportation, buildings, pensions. One of the largest local budget items in most states is public education. Then you got modern roads and bridges, paved highways, snow removal, engineering, and ongoing maintenance are far costlier than dirt wagon trails and volunteer statute labor. Public safety. You got police, fire departments with modern equipment. You also have emergency medical services. And then you have utilities and sanitation, like water, sewer, storm drainage, libraries, parks, social services, planning and zoning enforcement, solid waste collection. Then there's also the debt service and capital projects. School and municipal bonds add special levies, assessments that raise bills even above the base rate. The net effect? Local governments now require many more dollars per resident to provide services. So property taxes finance a vastly larger budget than they did in 1890. Talking point number 4. From in-kind self-provision to cash economy. In 1890, homesteaders could meet many needs by producing food, doing labor, and providing statute labor on roads. Taxes were small and sometimes even paid for in labor or produce. Today, nearly everything requires cash payments. Teachers' salaries, pensions, contractors, construction materials. Taxes must be paid in money now, which converts previously invisible burdens into a visible cash outflow. The result? Even if the percentage of value were similar, the modern taxpayer must extract that cash from an economy where land is valued much higher and all expenses are monetized. Talking point number 5. The legal and institutional changes. New taxing entities and mechanisms. More taxing units exist now. School districts, special districts like fire, water, port, cemetery, counties, cities, each with their own levies or bond measures. Together, they can push the effective local rate well above the simple state cap. Bond measures and voter-approved levies. Communities frequently approve debt, for schools, libraries, sewers that creates additional property tax obligations. Standardized appraisal and collection. Centralization and modernization make tax collection more efficient and consistent, which increases revenue even at a similar nominal rate. Talking point number 6. Improvements and land use changes are taxed too. A raw homestead with a sod house was a relatively low value improvement. Today, houses, barns, irrigation systems, paved driveways, wells, and other capital improvements significantly raise assessed value. Zoning changes or conversions. Farmland to residential development can multiply value in tax bills overnight. Talking point number 7. Public projects like irrigation, reclamation, dams directly raised values. Large federal and state projects like reclamation or irrigation projects, reservoirs, electrification, transformed marginal dry land into high-value irrigated farmland and orchards. When public investments increase a parcel's productive capacity, market values and therefore taxes rise. Talking point number 8. Monetary measurement versus real burden. A reminder about perspective. Nominal dollars blow up because of inflation. The $4 to $3,600 nominal example is heavily affected by inflation. The real comparison, inflation adjusted, is more meaningful. The $4 becomes $144 today, and that $3,600 bill is still 25 times higher in real terms. That 25x is structural, policy, market, and institutional increase we've been explaining. But tax burden measured as a share of household or farm income might tell a different story. Incomes have also risen substantially, so the tax as a percent of income could be lower or higher depending on the era and the local conditions. The key point: absolute dollars paid are much larger today, and services demanded are far greater. Talking point number 9. Concentration and scale effects. Modern agriculture often involves larger corporate-style holdings. When a large holding is assessed at high value, absolute tax dollars are large, even if the effective rate is similar. Economies of scale may mitigate per acre tax burdens for big operators, but total dollars are larger. Talking point number 10. Tax reliefs and offsets exist, but they don't erase the structural rise. Modern systems sometimes include homestead exemptions, senior deferrals, agricultural use valuation, or circuit breakers. These reduce some taxpayers' bills. However, such reliefs are targeted and don't change the overall structural fact. Market values, broader local government responsibilities, and modern assessment practices create much larger tax bills overall.